She saved a wounded man from freezing to death, but when the town discovered who he was, they turned on her like she'd committed a crime. The same neighbors who once promised to protect her came back with torches, chains, and hatred in their eyes. But Lilian Benton stood her ground, rifle in hand, and proved that mercy can be more powerful than fear. Just wait until you hear how one shot into the sky silenced an entire town, and why justice in the end had the final word. The blizzard tore across the sky like a wounded animal, its howls echoing down through the fir-lined ridges of Harper Creek. Snow swirled in maddening spirals, erasing shapes and sound until the world became a white void. Lilian Benton narrowed her eyes against the wind, one hand braced on the doorframe of her small log cabin, the other gripping a dull-handled axe. She had stepped out only to fetch more wood before the storm buried the pile entirely. Then she saw it. At the base of the nearby hill, half buried in snow and unmoving, lay a figure. Long limbs sprawled, a dark red stain spreading across what once was a fine wool coat. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she didn't move, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But then the wind shifted, and the silhouette slumped further, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She ran. The snow swallowed her boots and clawed at her skirts, but she pushed through. When she reached him, the man was ice cold to the touch, his face pale as ash, lips tinged with blue. His pulse fluttered faintly against her fingers, like a bird trapped in glass. He wasn't dead. Not yet. But if she left him here, he would be, before dawn. That much she knew with terrifying certainty. She had no idea who he was, didn't know where he came from, or why he was bleeding out in the middle of a snowstorm. He carried no weapon she could see, just a thick leather wallet half buried in his coat, and a name stitched onto a handkerchief tucked inside. R.J. McCall. It didn't matter. Not then. She heaved him over her shoulder, a feat that took every ounce of grit she had, and dragged him through the snow back to her cabin. The wind fought her every step, but she refused to stop. Not for fear, not for doubt, not even when her legs gave out halfway to the door, forcing her to crawl and drag him, like a wounded soldier through the mud. Inside, the fire had all but died. She threw more wood into the stove, knelt beside the man, and cut away the frozen layers from his boots and coat. His socks were soaked, toes stiff from the cold. Blood oozed from a gash across his ribs, mixing with melted snow in crimson streams across her floorboards. She cleaned the wound, her hands shaking from both cold and something deeper, the sense that her world had just changed, and not for the better. When she opened his wallet fully and saw the crest, a golden steer embossed into dark leather, her stomach turned. River James McCall. Even she knew that name. The McCalls owned the largest ranch in the county, thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle, more money than God, and twice the enemy's. The land wars between the McCalls and the townsfolk of Harper Creek had lasted for years. Broken deals, poisoned wells, grazing disputes that ended in court, or worse. If the town found him here, under her roof, she wouldn't just be seen as a stranger anymore. She'd be marked as a traitor, but it was too late now. She had made her choice. She didn't know what he had done or who might come looking for him. All she knew was simple, sharp, and absolute. She saved his life, and now hers no longer belonged to her, and 3 days passed in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against chipped porcelain. River lay on the cot near the stove, wrapped in layers of wool and quiet thoughts. His strength returned slowly but steadily. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as gravel and low, like the wind whispering through pine needles. He didn't ask her name. He didn't question where he was or why. Instead, he accepted the bowl of soup she handed him with a small nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. He ate slowly, every motion deliberate, as if aware that he'd been dragged back from the edge of something dark and final. At night, he wrapped himself in her old quilts, the same ones her mother once sewed by lantern light, and listened, not to music or conversation, but to the sound of wind pressing against wooden walls, to the groan of snow slipping from the roof, to the silence of a cabin too long forgotten. By the 5th day, everything changed. Lilian never heard the riders approach, just the sudden knock, hard, impatient, final. She opened the door with both hands raised, not in surrender, but in caution. 3 men stood in the snow, the sheriff, tall and grim, Tom Ellerby, who ran the stables, and Graham Finch, who once taught her how to fish when she was 10. None of them met her eyes. Their gazes drifted past her, into the warm shadows of the cabin, and settled on the figure lying on the bed. They didn't need to ask. They already knew. "McCall," the sheriff said flatly. Then Tom stepped forward and snapped, "You hiding him? After what his family did to Harperland?" Their words were blades, sharpened by history, dipped in resentment. No one waited for her answer. They turned and left, boots crunching through the snow, but the echo of their arrival lingered. And in a place like Harper Creek, echoes always turned into roars. By dusk, it had begun. First, the cold stares through frosted windows, then the stones, small ones at first, tapping against the glass like warnings. Then paint, angry and red, scrawled across her front door. Witch of McCall. The name was louder than her own. When she went to town the next morning, the world was colder than the wind. Mr. Cooper, who had sold her flour for over a decade, refused to look at her. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the register and said, without meeting her eyes, "Try somewhere else." But there was nowhere else. Children pointed and whispered. One bold boy, a Harland, judging by the nose, shouted, "Traitor!" and darted behind a wagon before she could turn. River saw it all, not at once, but in pieces, through the cracked window, in the stiff way she walked, in the tightness of her jaw when she came back with an empty basket. But still, he said nothing, not because he didn't care, but because he knew. Some debts couldn't be repaid with words, and some kindnesses came with a price that neither of them was prepared to count, until the whole town forced their hands. The knock didn't come, neither did voices. Instead, it was the light, flickering orange behind the trees, that reached her window first. Then the crunch of boots in the snow, slow, measured, like wolves circling prey. Lilian stepped back from the door, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the wind. She glanced at River. He had heard it too. Despite the pain in his leg, he was already rising from the cot, steadying himself on the edge of the table. His eyes didn't blink, didn't question. They were here. When the first fist pounded on the door, the cabin shook. She didn't get the chance to answer. The door flew open with a snap of cold air and splinters. 10 men filled the doorway, shoulders hunched against the wind, faces twisted by torchlight, and something darker. Disappointment, betrayal, and old bitterness that now had a name. McCall. She knew them all. That made it worse. There was Thomas Kearney, who once fixed her roof without asking for payment. Elias Brower, who shared apples from his orchard when she was a girl. And Frank Dodd, her father's oldest friend, the man who used to lift her onto his shoulders to see fireworks on Independence Day. It was Frank who moved first. He yanked her by the arm, fingers like iron, and dragged her out into the snow. Her boots slipped on ice as she stumbled forward, breath catching in her throat. Her hair snagged on her shawl. No one helped. Then River stepped out behind her. He leaned hard on the doorframe, but he stood tall. The cold lit his breath in silver clouds. His face was pale but calm, the kind of calm that silences rooms. "If it's blood you want," he said, voice raw and level, "take mine. She saved me. I owe her my life." His words hovered in the air like snowflakes, but none of the men reached for them. Frank's lip curled. One of the others spit on the ground inches from River's boot. Not one of them turned to leave. And something inside Lilian, something long buried and quiet, finally snapped. She pulled away from Frank's grip and stepped back into the cabin. When she returned, she held her father's old rifle in both hands, the same rifle he once taught her to clean while telling her stories about honor and backbone, and when to draw the line. She walked between River and the crowd and stopped. "No more," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "I didn't save him so you could destroy me for it." They didn't answer. Torches hissed in the snow. Somewhere in the back, someone shifted his stance. Fingers twitched on rope and rusted metal. The cold bit into her cheeks, but she didn't feel it. "You want to test what a witch's daughter can do?" she added, eyes locked on the man who once promised her family loyalty. "Stay and find out." A beat, then two. One man stepped forward. That was enough. River raised his revolver and fired. Once, high into the sky, the blast cracked through the trees, scattering birds into the night. The silence that followed was louder than the gunshot. The crowd didn't run, but they didn't advance either. Behind them, the sheriff appeared on horseback. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't say a word, but the way his eyes swept over the scene said it all. One more step, and none of us walk away clean. For a moment, winter stood still. Morning came, soft and gray, with a thin veil of frost glazing the rooftops of Harper Creek. Smoke curled cautiously from chimneys. Doors opened slower than usual. For the first time in days, the town wasn't buzzing with accusation, but humming with the weight of everything left unsaid. No one had died the night before, but something else had. Something deeper. The town's illusion of unity, its myth of righteousness. The sheriff came by just after sunrise. He didn't ride in loud or make a scene. He stood on Lilian's porch, hat in hand, and handed her a citation for disturbing the peace. She took it without flinching. He paused, then leaned in close, as if afraid the wind might overhear. "You handled them better than I ever could," he whispered. "Smart way you stood your ground." And then he left. A week later, a letter arrived, parchment folded neat, sealed in wax, the crest unmistakable. McCall Ranch. Inside, R.J. McCall's handwriting was steady and unembellished. "You saved my life. Now I'd like to protect yours. Come here. The gates are open, and it's safer than where you are." Lilian read it once, folded it, then placed it in the wooden box where she kept things worth remembering. Not because she would go, but because it mattered that someone had offered. She stayed. Her cabin, perched at the edge of the pines, stood unchanged, but the town that once spat at her shadow had started to blink, uncertain, humbled. No more broken windows, no more slurs carved into her door. The same men who had thrown stones now tipped their hats when she passed. Some mumbled apologies they didn't know how to phrase. Others simply stepped aside, with a stiffness that smelled of shame. Even the children, wild with rumors days before, now watched her with quiet awe, as if unsure whether she was still a witch or something greater. Because something had shifted. They no longer saw a recluse, or a legacy of whispered curses and broken bloodlines. Now they saw a woman who had cradled a dying man in a storm, who had stood barefoot in the snow between a mob and a wounded soul, and dared them to cross her line. A woman who chose decency over safety, and didn't flinch when that choice nearly cost her everything. And so, when the wind whistled through the streets of Harper Creek that winter, it carried more than cold. It carried respect, and in some corners, the quiet tremble of fear. Because now they knew kindness, when tested, could stand taller than rifles, and mercy, when cornered, could fire back. The sheriff came by just after sunrise. He didn't ride in loud or make a scene. He stood on Lilian's porch, hat in hand, and handed her a citation for disturbing the peace. She took it without flinching. He paused, then leaned in close, as if afraid the wind might overhear. "You handled them better than I ever could," he whispered. "Smart way you stood your ground." And then he left. A week later, a letter arrived, parchment folded neat, sealed in wax, the crest unmistakable. McCall Ranch. Inside, R.J. McCall's handwriting was steady and unembellished. "You saved my life. Now I'd like to protect yours. Come here. The gates are open, and it's safer than where you are." Lilian read it once, folded it, then placed it in the wooden box where she kept things worth remembering. Not because she would go, but because it mattered that someone had offered. she stayed. Her cabin, perched at the edge of the pines, stood unchanged, but the town that once spat at her shadow had started to blink, uncertain, humbled. No more broken windows, no more slurs carved into her door. The same men who had thrown stones now tipped their hats when she passed. Some mumbled apologies they didn't know how to phrase. Others simply stepped aside, with a stiffness that smelled of shame. Even the children, wild with rumors days before, now watched her with quiet awe, as if unsure whether she was still a witch or something greater. Because something had shifted. They no longer saw a recluse, or a legacy of whispered curses and broken bloodlines. Now they saw a woman who had cradled a dying man in a storm, who had stood barefoot in the snow between a mob and a wounded soul, and dared them to cross her line. A woman who chose decency over safety, and didn't flinch when that choice nearly cost her everything. And so, when the wind whistled through the streets of Harper Creek that winter, it carried more than cold. It carried respect, and in some corners, the quiet tremble of fear. Because now they knew kindness, when tested, could stand taller than rifles, and mercy, when cornered, could fire back.